Welcome back to the show, Alex.
Pleasure to be here. Thanks for having me.
It's an absolute pleasure to have you back on. And, we're all doing these virtual tours at the moment because we can't speak in public. We can't meet in public places, but this is the next best thing. And how are you holding up over in Switzerland at the moment?
It's great. Spring is coming, sun outside. Obviously, as long as everybody around me is healthy.
Yeah.
I'm happy. You can't change things you can't change, so things are good.
No, that's it. It's a very stoic philosophy, focus on what you can control, right? Have there been any silver linings that have come out of lockdown for you? Like in my case, I found myself writing absolutely every single day, a lot more than I normally do. How about yourself?
Well, traveling less. I like traveling, but I don't miss it. Traveling less, having time to work on certain things is absolutely great, right? So we're launching a new virtual masterclass. I got time to work on that because it's the same content, but a different format requires different interactions. So you have to think about those things.
Yeah.
We just launched our book, so I have time to actually put energy into that, do online speaking. So it's a lot more work than normal. I don't travel, but now, I'm at my desk 12, 16 hours per day. So
yeah,
it's fun. It's fun. It's a great opportunity to do things that I can't do when I travel.
Yeah. And it can be difficult for people who, whether they want to be at their desks or not, to actually switch off. Like I'm recording this from the comfort of my kitchen table because this is the most natural light I get in my house. And so sometimes I'll be wondering over at 8 p.m., 9 p.m., what's happening, even though I tell people not to do that kind of thing because you should kind of cultivate space for other things. Correct, you still catch yourself doing it every now and again, but it is what it is. You mentioned you've released a new book and you're working on promoting that at the moment. You've been quite busy since we last spoke about 2 years ago. You released Testing Business Ideas, and the newly released The Invincible Company, How to Constantly Reinvent Your Organization with Inspiration from the World's Best Business Models. Now, of course, that is something that is of utmost importance to companies today in this time of COVID-19. But first, how do you define an invincible company, Alex?
So no company can be invincible, right? It's a very arrogant title, but we tested it and it seemed to fly, really well with senior executives around the world.
Yeah.
But what you can do is you can constantly reinvent yourself, right? That's the goal. So, and how do you do that? That's what we describe in the book. And when we observed all of these different companies and looked at what they have in common, it's actually three things. The first one, as I said, they constantly reinvent themselves, right? They might have a successful business once, but they don't just lean back. They reinvent themselves before they have to. That's the key word here. They don't wait for a crisis. So they build, innovation portfolios. They really look ahead. The second one is that they don't just compete on products or price or technology. They actually build superior business models that can really stand out and are defensible. And they often have a portfolio of these defensible business models. And the third characteristic is that they increasingly transcend industry boundaries. That means, you can't classify them in an industry anymore. They're not in banking, insurance, pharmaceuticals. They go beyond specific industries. You could say they compete in arenas, to use a term, coined by Rita McGrath that she uses a lot. And that goes beyond industry boundaries. So you also see players emerging, from one industry, all of a sudden they move into a different arena. My favorite example is Ping An, moving from insurance and banking into 5 different arenas. One of them is health. Building the biggest health platform on the planet with Ping An Good Doctor, 300 million users. Yeah. Wow. That coming from an insurance company, not from a pharmaceutical like Novartis and Roche, the Swiss ones, or Pfizer or so. That's amazing. So when you compete on these 3 characteristics, it's very, very hard to catch you. So these are the 3 things that invincible companies all have in common.
And we'll definitely unpack what some companies you've profiled in the book are doing across those 3 spaces. But first, I guess in the spirit of COVID-19, recently I had a conversation with Seth Godin, and we're talking about the assembly line and how it's a great analogy for companies that are really efficient at doing one thing well. Yeah. But when the world changes, then you're efficient at doing the wrong thing well, and it's actually does more harm than good. Now, in the short term, COVID-19 may do more harm than good for many leaders, for many companies. but might it actually serve as some kind of a wake-up call for organizations across the world?
Yeah, I do think so. So let me try to share my screen and scribble something, because there's a fundamental thing that happened, and I think you can see my screen now.
Yes.
Is that right? Okay, so I divide companies into two worlds, the exploit world of managing what you have, and the explore world of inventing the future. And over here, uncertainty is usually very high, because when you invent new stuff, you go into new markets, you don't really know what's going to work. It's, new customers, et cetera, maybe new technology. Over here, uncertainty is relatively low, because, you're doing the business you've been doing for years or decades. You kind of know it. And these are two very different worlds, and they require different behaviors. But what happened with COVID-19 is all of a sudden, all of us were catapulted over here into an uncertain world. The rules of yesterday, they don't work anymore. So the business models we had here, so I'll draw a little business model canvas, they don't work the same way anymore. Some of them are completely disrupted, like travel, tourism, and some of them, just have to reinvent themselves. They have to pivot into something new. So this forces us to work in a different way. And on the left-hand side, it's very iterative as an approach. Have an idea, you test it, and you adapt it until you figure it out. But that, I would say, is almost an opportunity, because now that everybody is disrupted, you have to explore. You have to become an explorer. And that is, to a certain extent, great opportunity, because if you didn't learn how to do innovation, you didn't prepare yourself for disruption, now you have to. You don't have a choice.
Yeah.
And obviously, for those who don't have this in their DNA, so they didn't, build this capacities, it's hard to do overnight. They, are struggling more than those companies that already built the skills, already have that culture of exploration. It's hard to do overnight. Those who've already done it before, they're ready for this, because COVID-19 is nothing else than a disruption, a very big one, kind of atomic bomb scenario. But it catapults us into a disrupted world, which ultimately will happen to every company. It's just that now it happens to everybody at the same time. And there are only few that benefit from COVID-19, like Netflix or so. But that, forces us to rethink. And it goes beyond that even, maybe a little bit outside of the core stuff I write about. It also forces organizations to rethink how they work in terms of processes, how they treat their people, right? The frontline workers, with miserable salaries. So this is really a disruption that I believe will have a ripple effect for many decades to come, beyond the obvious, economic impact and the economic difficulties that every company, and every economy will actually have.
Yeah. And just on how companies work, something you do touch on in the book is this thing called the culture map, whereby we're looking at certain behaviors we want to demonstrate. But in order to get those behaviors out of people, we need to ensure that the processes, policies, and systems support that. So in many companies who perhaps spent all their time exploiting an existing business model, they might have really high delegations of authority where small decisions need to go before a committee to get made. Now, of course, that's not going to help us explore lots and lots of different crazy ideas, which are more likely than not to fail. So in those cases, first step is really changing the way we do things, I would think.
Absolutely. The whole functioning between those two worlds is completely different. And I like to say, innovation, exploration, entrepreneurship, that's a profession. You learn it, just like it takes a long time until you become a heart surgeon. Guess what? Innovation is difficult as well. You have to learn the anatomy and physiology of business and building businesses. And then, only after a long process of learning do you get to do it. And then when you do it, the beginning is very hard. In medicine, you snip it on dead bodies in simulation before you go to the real thing. So it's very similar, right? So it's hard to do. Now, what leaders have to do to kind of foster that exploration mindset is work on the culture, absolutely. And that's why we dedicated a whole chapter on that topic, which could be a whole book. And when I say, you can design culture, people usually say, Alex, no, you can't design culture. And then I say, well, culture happens somehow. And today the problem is exactly that people let culture happen. They don't design and manage it. And you can. Obviously, it takes time, but you can deliberately design culture. But you can't design it like a car, right? Because we're talking about social systems here. I like to use the terminology of Dave Gray, who invented this culture map with us. Together, he did the heavy lifting conceptually, and then we helped him with the tool. He likes to say you design culture like a garden. You really you work on the fertile ground, you take care of it, and you can create those enablers and take away those blockers for a beautiful garden to emerge. That's the way you need to think of culture, and that's the role of the leader. Which blockers do I need to take away? What you just mentioned, having validation on every single decision, that might make sense in execution, where we're talking about 5-minute down on a website, Amazon, for example, can cost millions and millions of dollars. So there you need to be very careful. In exploration, on the other hand, it's a different thing, right? Autonomous teams acting very quickly because the mistakes are very cheap and they're actually important to make so you can learn. So you need to be bold, different processes. So leaders have to design the conditions for innovation to thrive, for explorers to thrive. And that's what leaders can do now. And that means, give teams the autonomy to explore, to make decisions very quickly, give them the liberty and legitimacy to make a ton of mistakes, as long as those mistakes are manageable and cheap, right? And you learn from that, because the hardest thing in innovation are not the ideas. Every company has great ideas. Yeah. Every company has great people. What they don't have is a space where innovation can thrive. And that's what leaders need to do now very fast, okay? Create those places where the explorers can thrive and actually pivot parts of the business model very quickly. And, test it first before you implement. There's this misconception in established companies. When we want big results, we need to make big investments, very risky. It's actually the other way around. You make small investments first to test what works. And only when you have sufficient evidence do you put the big bucks and scale it, right? So there are a couple of misconceptions when it comes to exploration. It's expensive, it's risky. So we have to kill those myths. Sorry, I get excited about this, so I go on.
It's fantastic.
I want to say everything in one sentence.
There's like three or four things that I want to double click on there. But the first thing you mentioned just around culture and how you can kind of design it in a way. To me, I draw parallels between that and what James Clear talks about with habit formation. Your personal habits are a lagging indicator of your systems. So if my systems all lead me to eat a lot of junk food and not work out and all that sort of stuff, eventually those habits are going to show up in my day-to-day, and the result is going to speak for itself. And when it comes to systems, same sort of thing. If we want people to experiment, we might change the processes, and then there'll be a lag. People will be uncomfortable running experiments, taking risks themselves, not putting things before other people. But after a while, the behaviors will catch up to those new systems. So the behaviors are a lagging indicator of those new designs. But I just find that interesting how there's these parallels between personal productivity and company behaviors and culture. But the one thing you said there that around manageable, cheap experiments, it is so true, because so many organizations in this space might run isolated initiatives, maybe an accelerator program, maybe invest in 1 or 2 startups. But as you pointed out in your book, you might need to run 200 experiments to identify maybe 2 or 3 ideas that might build or support that new growth engine. Kind of like a venture capitalist who might meet 2,000 companies a year, invest in 20, and then of those 20, 2 are home runs, 5 or 6 are kind of okay, and the rest are massive failures. And I think that's something that perhaps leaders at many more traditional organizations perhaps still haven't caught onto. And it's something that you try and really emphasize in this book. I've just lost your audio.
Okay, let me show you. Yeah, I'll go back to the sharing the screen here, right? So it's exactly what you said, right? There are a couple of myths when it comes to exploration, and the big one that you mentioned is we make 1 or 2 or 3 big investments to get a big return. Mm-hmm. But basically here, if you look at how many ideas you need to explore to create one big winner here, one outlier, like a multi-billion-dollar business. Guess how many you have to invest in? You mentioned, right, venture capitalists, they meet maybe 2,000, they invest in 20. The ratio is actually 250 to 1 in order to create an outlier. So early stage venture capital shows that only 1 out of 250 or 4 out of 1,000 actually produce. I'm trying to stop sharing the window here. Produce outsized results.
Yep.
That means that as a company, you need to invest in many, make small bets. But here's the thing. You actually have to kill many of these small bets after a short amount of time, after 3 months, for example, and then only double down on those that are working. So a good example of a company that's done this is Bosch. Very systematically, over 3 years, they've invested into 200 projects, okay? They give them about 130,000 euro and 3 months. And after those 3 months, listen here, they kill 70% of the projects. Actually, they don't kill them. They only provide follow-up investments in 30% of the projects. And what's interesting is they don't tell them, oh, you're not getting follow-up investment. They have very clear metrics of what the teams need to deliver in terms of evidence for them to deserve going to the next round. So actually the teams self-select. There's a 90% overlap between the teams, their opinion and the opinion of, the incubator or accelerator itself. So then they take these 30% of the 200 and they do the same thing maybe for 6 months with a little bit more in a bigger investment, maybe 300,000 euro or so. And again, after 6 months, maybe more, it's a little bit more variable, they only invest in 30%. So that means in 3 years, from the 200 they started with, 14 only made it to exploit and became real, projects, either as a standalone or integrated into a business unit. That's the way you invest in innovation. So the two ways of investing in exploit and explore are very different because in exploit, you build a new factory, you scale you increase the sales force. Guess what? You do make big investments into one plan that you will execute on time and on budget. That works in execution because you know what you're dealing with. In exploration, you can't do that. Business plans are your worst enemy. Spreadsheets with fantasy numbers are your worst enemy, because they look real, and when the presenter is really good, creates a reality distortion field. You're gonna want to throw the money at the person. The problem is the only thing that matters is opinion. And Steve Blank likes to say, the founder of the Lean Startup movement, he likes to say the very fine line between hallucination, the vision, and hallucination. Right? Sometimes people mistake the two. So what people present well as a vision, entrepreneurs are really good at creating a reality distortion field. Can actually be a hallucination. And in the startup world and the corporate world, there's numerous examples of big bets in great ideas that looked amazing on paper that, went south. Better Place, good example, it could have been the Tesla of today. Turns out they burnt $850 million trying to create battery swapping stations where people could change the battery in electric vehicles. Looked great on paper. Wonderful, green, sustainable vision, but it was a hallucination. Great vision turned out to be a hallucination. So you need to test these ideas rigorously.
Yeah. And as entrepreneurs, I think something that we probably relate to a lot is this thing called the optimism bias, where looking forward, you see nothing but rainbows and blue skies, and this is going to be amazing. Why would the world not pick this up? Why would there not be customer appetite for this? And then you release it and you market it and you do all these things, and it's just crickets.
But you need it, right? So here's the thing: the entrepreneurship and innovation is a combination between art and science. If it's only the art part, well, then you might be a visionary. And I have a friend who likes to say, if you have visions, you maybe have to go to the doctor, right? But there is that art part where you need to see things others don't, where you need to be optimistic, where others say you're crazy. You need that part. But then you have the science part, and literally we can call it the science part, where you have hypothesis underlying your big idea, and you're going to rigorously test those hypotheses. Obviously not like a scientist, because we're not talking about natural systems. There are no laws in the economy, if you want. Simple ones like, okay, I have to create value for customers. But you actually have to adapt your idea based on the hypothesis that turned out to be wrong. So you navigate between this crazy optimism and your vision, and then the pure pragmatism of testing. Because it turns out, actually, research shows that entrepreneurs are more risk averse than the general population, which sounds crazy. But here's the thing, they test their assumptions a lot more, right? So they're not crazy naive in the big bets they make. Some, yeah, of course, first-time entrepreneurs. But that's that mix between vision, okay, art, if you want, and science and pragmatism. And that's the great mix of great innovators and entrepreneurs. They're not just crazy, those crazy people. No, they're actually pretty pragmatic. And if you don't have that, you're probably just going to burn through cash. So it's this back and forth, right? And, you know, a lot of people like to say you can have this long-term vision, but the steps of how to get there, that has to change, right? You're very rigorous and stubborn when it comes to vision, but you're not stubborn on how to get there. And, you know, good example, actually very concrete example is Netflix. They had this idea of streaming video, which we know it for today. But, you know, when they started out, the infrastructure wasn't good enough for streaming video. So they started out with a DVD by mail in order to kind of get to their longer term vision. So those steps, they constantly adapted. And while they were doing that, they learned a ton already for streaming in terms of what customers like and how this works out, creating customer relationships. So that's that kind of mix between vision and optimism and pragmatism and testing ideas. So you're back and forth between the two. And everybody who is an entrepreneur or has done innovation knows there are moments where you're actually not that optimistic because you think that this is never going to work out. Right? It's crazy.
Yeah. And I was lucky enough to have Mark Randolph of Netflix on the show to talk about those early days and how they actually tried to sell Netflix to Amazon at one point, but it didn't go through. And so they had no plan B at that point and had to make it work. Either that or lose all the money that Reed Hastings had invested. But on this art versus science, and science being perhaps you can run experiments, you can have hypotheses, but I think it's really key. What you touched on there is that you can't guarantee success, but perhaps I'll channel Richard Feynman, the great physicist, who said, you can never be sure you're right. You can only be sure you're wrong. But by falsifying hypotheses, what you can do is get closer to more right or to less wrong. And then you make, like Correct. You said, these calculated decisions by entrepreneurs who perhaps are less risk averse than the general population. So I think what's important there is there's a big thing that, you know, when we look at successful entrepreneurs, you know, we put them on a pedestal and, you know, they're on the cover of a magazine or so. We only see the shining part, right? And then the entrepreneurs and innovators, usually when they tell this story, they put away all the stuff that was painful, all the mistakes they made because they want to look smart, right? But when the reality, if you look at those stories, until those people looked smart, or teams, because it's rarely just a person, right? Until those teams looked smart, they looked stupid for a very long time. You know, you talk about Netflix, or, you know, Airbnb would be another example. It wasn't easy for them to raise money. They wanted to sell a company, etc. They looked stupid for a very long time until they looked smart. And that's the key thing. You know, entrepreneurs have this stamina of going on and solving one problem after the other, doing one tiny or big pivot after the other, because things never work until they work, right? And that's the thing that we don't see. And that's why, you know, entrepreneurship and innovation is always seen as this glamorous thing. It's dirty work. You need to roll up your sleeves. It's really tough. Of course, it's rewarding and it's a calling. People who do this, they love doing it, but it's tough. And that's the part we don't always see. And there's also, you know, you can do as much of this testing as you want. There will always be contradicting data. It will never be clear. And it's a ton of hard work, 20, 30, 50 experiments until you start to see the right patterns. It's never this clear thing. So, you know, I have this
I'm developing this allergy against, I'm going to do one experiment or two, and then I'm going to figure it out and the path is going to open up. Entrepreneurship and innovation is tough. And anybody who tells you otherwise has never done it, right? Mm-hmm. It's very rare, can happen that you fall upon the right idea, but that's 1 out of a million, right? But most of them went through many, many different sufferings. A lot of successful entrepreneurs behind WhatsApp, for example, they were rejected when they applied for jobs, right?
Yeah.
They weren't taken seriously. So there's these myths still that we have: the creative genius, the big idea, and you just need to find it and then find financing. I'm going to get it right. Those are all wrong, and I think we don't fight against them enough. So there's a young generation of first-time entrepreneurs who don't really know what they're getting into, and they do it the wrong way. Now, obviously, podcasts like yours and the new way of teaching these things is getting towards this profession of entrepreneurship and innovation that, Steve Blank launched, kind of this educational revolution, mm-hmm. and I think is really spreading across the world.
Yeah. And, that narrative fallacy that you speak about is real. When we do become successful at something, it's easy to draw a straight line between all the things we did to get us there and completely forget everything else that just didn't work, right? So I think that's something that maybe a lot of business books that I've read as well are guilty of when they go off and they say, this is exactly what you need to do. But it may have worked for that company at that time with their unique circumstances and everything, but it's 2020 and your company is different. Your customers have different appetite. We've got COVID-19. It's a different world. So just something to bear in mind there for entrepreneurs listening to this. But on market validation as well, like you said, you can test things, you might validate things. But this morning I actually spoke with Michael Fox on this podcast, who co-founded Shoes of Prey. Now they were an online retail company that whereby women could customize shoes and have those shoes delivered and all that sort of stuff. And they raised $25 million across 4 rounds of funding. They took their revenue from 2.5 million organically up to about 12.5 million. NPS scores were above 90. They had all these positive indicators, and the market research they did suggested this could be a market worth hundreds and hundreds of millions, but they didn't quite make it. They kind of stalled at 12.5. Long story short, after a number of years, they had to shut down operations. So they went from this high-flying startup profiled in all the Australian tech media to nothing, which is kind of, in a way, I guess, as you said, Steve Blank, testing ideas. There's a lot of talk about that, but at the same time, don't let that fool you into this idea that just because you did some validation, that means 100% this is going to work. There are a lot of unknowns that you need to control for that perhaps you can't control for.
And that's a big idea, right? So I believe, looking at those companies that are successful long-term, it actually turns out they're very obsessive. They believe they're going to die. So they constantly improve. They constantly reinvent. They never believe they've made it. Jeff Bezos is known for this. A lot of things, Amazon, Jeff Bezos might not have gotten right or still didn't get right immediately. But one thing they do understand is innovation, because there's this obsession that Amazon is going to go out of business, right? They're at the very top. They still have this obsession. Amazon is going to die. And, Jeff Bezos says this publicly to his shareholders. But that is the foundation, this obsession of constantly reinventing yourself, never getting arrogant, because that's the thing. When you're successful, people throw money at you, you're in the cover of magazines, very easy to get arrogant and believe you've made it. Mm-hmm. You never make it because we have a competitive environment, right? But here's the thing. There's a method to this now that you can actually constantly assess your business model. Ask yourself, are you at risk of disruption? We created tools in the new book to do that. And on the other hand, you have to constantly improve your business model. Because today, and I think this is a huge opportunity, still most companies, when they say innovation or improvement, they think technology, they think products, they think new markets. But it turns out that most successful companies, they design superior business models. They constantly shift an outmoded, expiring business model towards a better one. So you can never stop. And what looks good, you say, the market is growing, that's going in the right direction. Be careful, right? Stay rigorous in terms of reinventing. And that comes back to the beginning of what we talked about. Exploit, explore. you do have to put in place some processes where you start to scale and focus on what's working. Mm-hmm. And in parallel, not instead of, but in parallel, you need to keep this explorer mindset. What could we do differently? What else could we change? Are there new areas that we should explore? And that's the hard thing. That's what academics often call the ambidextrous organization. Can we do both at the same time? That's hard. But that's what you need to do so you don't get disrupted, so you actually always move forward. Be world-class at execution and management, and be world-class at exploration and invention of the future. Yeah. That's very hard to do in parallel. But we know a lot of the basics of how to do this. So it's not a question of, it's not a black box anymore. The tools are there, the processes are there. Now it's all about commitment. If the leadership commits to doing this, the tools are there. So it is possible. It's not black magic. It's not even that hard, I would say, if you look at some of the successful companies who've done this. Ping An is a big example in China. Went from the top 400 companies to the top 30 companies by reinventing themselves in less than a decade. Logitech, smaller company, known for these things here, computer mice. They reinvented themselves in less than a decade with the CEO, Bracken Darrell, right? They reallocated 75% of their resources from what they call the trees that are big and stable but dying towards the seeds, which are the future of tomorrow. So Bracken Darrell likes to speak about seeds, plants, and trees. But it takes a big management commitment to reallocate those resources. And many companies, they don't reallocate those resources into the future. Now here, I'll be a little bit, political here or controversial.
Go for it.
Many companies use that money from their success to buy back shares, to reward shareholders. Now, of course you want to reward shareholders, but you just need to be aware, if you buy back shares, if you burn that cash that you built up, you are not going to have what it takes to actually explore the future. That's why Amazon is pretty amazing, right? Over 2 decades, they said, we're not making a profit. Yeah. But they didn't make a profit because they reinvested in the future. So the shareholder return came from, rising shares. And if you did invest in Amazon, 2 decades ago, you don't have to work anymore. COVID-19 is not a problem for you.
Yeah.
But that's a different kind of thing. Now, ideally, companies have those two mentalities. Stable dividends from their exploit engine and reinvesting in the future. It's not either or, it's and. You don't need to reinvest everything. You can buy back some shares, but you got to be careful, right? So I think we're in the extreme of just exploit. Roger Martin, great thinker, was #1 business thinker of the world for a long time. He writes about this, that we've been too much into this efficiency and exploiting what we have, and we stopped investing in the future. Mark Andreessen just wrote about this as well. We need to reinvest in inventing the future, because while we think we're doing it, because we hear about venture capital stories, in the bigger sense, we are not. As economies, as countries, we're not investing in the future enough. And this is not just R&D and science. We're doing some of that, but it's really entrepreneurship, creating new value for customers, for companies, and for society, right? That's the key thing, that we need to really reinvent the future. And COVID-19, I see that as an opportunity. With all the challenges and suffering that come with it, it's an opportunity to reset, to really think differently across the board.
Could not agree more. And I think just on Jeff Bezos, on not making a profit for about 20 odd years, and even now, very, very slim margin of 1 to 2%. I think from day one, though, from 1997, I think the shareholder letter basically said, we're going to reinvest profit into the future. Don't invest in this company. Don't buy shares unless you're willing to play the long game with us and you're willing to be patient and back innovation. And that's something that I think is fundamental in setting those expectations up front with investors. And just on reinventing the future, I know Eric Ries has got this idea that he's been working on with the SEC around a long-term stock exchange, which might support this kind of thing, because that is really one of the big conflicts with the current share market is investors expect quarterly returns, right? So if you have a share market that's dedicated to long-term change, innovation, growth, then perhaps that will support companies and make it easier for them to make decisions with the future in mind rather than the next quarter.
Yeah, I'll be controversial here as well, right? It's a very convenient excuse that many CEOs have. Yeah. And I'm always careful when I say that, right? So just remembering the last big meeting I had with one of the largest European financial institutions with their CEOs, I'm very careful when I say these things, right? Because these people are under huge pressure. And for me, it's easy. I'm in my comfortable chair. Yeah. I don't have to decide, over multi-billion-dollar investments and the future of a company. However, I believe if you look at some of the examples, there are senior executives who really invested in the long term in, as a publicly quoted company. Now, for Jeff Bezos, let's say it's relatively easy, or for those companies where the founders have the majority votes, right? They might not be majority shareholders, but they created a system where they have most votes. But now take a company like Unilever. When Paul Polman took over as a CEO, the first thing he did, okay, this is a publicly listed company. First thing he did is he abolished quarterly results. And he told shareholders that if you invest with us, be aware you're in it for the long term. And then they rolled out their strategy, which was all about, sustainable living, sustainability investment, focusing not just on profits, but on a sustainable future in order to create profits where, profit and sustainability from an environmental point of view would be in harmony. And he did that in a publicly listed company. So it is possible. It's really hard, and given the short tenure of CEOs, is very risky, but it can be done, right? So easy again for me to say it's an easy excuse to say, we can't do this because it's short. Everybody wants short term. You can do it. So, I love the initiative from Eric Ries, this whole idea of long-term stock exchange. But even today, it can be done with all the pressures that come with it. And I think now we're seeing, again, COVID-19 as an opportunity. Now we're seeing those companies who've done it, they're well positioned to get through this crisis. Okay, so guess why the major US airlines are not going to get through this crisis without government support? Because they did not think long term. They bought back shares, they paid huge bonuses, and they didn't invest in the long-term future. It's also very tough businesses, let's admit it, but they really did not think long-term enough. Then you take Warren Buffett's Berkshire Hathaway, right? They have over, almost close to $200 billion in cash on the sidelines, which is a huge opportunity. They could actually invest now, which Warren Buffett usually does when stock prices go down. Side comment, now even he is not buying at the moment because it's so uncertain, but you can create that cushion. You can think long term. You just have to be willing to do it. And that is, again, leadership commitment. So I believe what's going to emerge from this crisis is a new type of leadership, of leaders who are going to have a completely different style of management, who are going to be much more long term, and who will also be more entrepreneurial and comfortable with exploring uncertainty. So I think, again, we're going to see some very positive things coming out of this COVID-19, very painful kind of atomic bomb scenario. So I'm very optimistic about the good things that this is going to, catalyze.
No, that's very well said. And I think it ties into something else that you've touched on in your book. This short-termism oftentimes manifests itself in companies investing, say, hundreds of thousands of dollars in testing multiple ideas, maybe hundreds of ideas, as was the case with Bosch. But if they don't get a return, say, in the first X number of months, we pull the rug out from under these ideas because they're not going to help us hit our growth targets for the year. Now, that doesn't make sense, because if you're investing in truly uncertain ideas, then they're probably not going to really help you with those growth targets until a few years down the track, if ever, in most cases. But if you do take that longer term view, perhaps you will have a little bit more patience to let certain ideas evolve over time. Now, of course, some ideas you will kill after the first round of funding, some after the second, some after the third. You apply that metered approach. But what sort of guidance do you provide for leaders when it comes to knowing whether to kill an idea or to persevere with it as we're running a portfolio of Explore?
Yeah, so maybe back to that comment, right? The long-term approach, you still need to, bet on short-term, projects and returns and quick wins. So I always like to work on several levels. It doesn't mean because you're working on the big, long-term thing, which is going to be 1 out of 250, that you shouldn't create quick wins. And that's, quickly side comment is that's also why innovation in companies should sit in two places. One is in a separate entity, which is connected to the core, where you can have breakthrough innovation. That's where you create the new growth engines, tomorrow's, future of your business. Those need to be disconnected a little bit from the core, because otherwise the core is going to, push them back into the traditional business model. That's why they need to be a little bit outside, but not too much, because otherwise they can't draw on the strengths of the core, like the resources like brand, access to customers, etc. So too separate, that's a mistake that companies made. That's not good. What you also need is an innovation engine with the same processes, but a slightly different focus within the business units, within the teams. And that is more efficiency innovation and sustaining innovation. So a lot of companies like to use this horizon model from McKinsey. H1 and H2 is closer to the core. Horizon 3, H3 is more out. So you need to perform different types of innovations in different parts of the organization. The tools and processes are the same, but the objective is different, right? So that's where innovation already needs to sit. And now I obviously forgot, what question I was actually answering.
The question was essentially about knowing when to kill or persevere with an idea.
Perfect. Okay, so now after this detour, back to this. So what's really important is you kill ideas in exploration, in innovation, based on evidence, not based on opinion. And that's why we first have to educate, to a certain extent, even investors these days still, but definitely leaders in companies or, entrepreneurs, young entrepreneurs coming out of university. So what does this mean? Evidence seems like an abstract word, right? When you have a new business idea, there are 4 types of risks, okay? 4 types of hypotheses that are underlying your new idea. First one is desirability. Do customers even want this thing? Okay, that's desirability risk. Second one is feasibility. Can we build this thing? Can we manage the technology? Can we scale it? Can we, manage the patents? And then there is viability. Can we earn more money from it than we spend? And the last one is adaptability. Is the infrastructure there in the economy? Is it the right timing? These are 4 types of risks that you need to make explicit because they're underlying your idea. Then you ask yourself, which one can I test first? And you go out and experiment. One simple experiment is talking to 10, 50, 100 potential customers, figuring out, do they even have those jobs, pains, and gains? Are they willing to pay? And what you learn from that is evidence. So the different types of evidence could be, customer interviews, so you get quotes. Could be, signed documents, memorandums of understanding. Could be pre-purchases. Could be, stuff that you talk to the experts in the supply chain, so you have very concrete numbers in terms of cost. So you need to test all of these different hypotheses, and that will allow you to gather evidence. You break down this big idea into smaller chunks. You test the smaller chunks. The evidence for those smaller chunks show you if you should continue investing. If a team in 3 months can't produce any evidence, you probably should kill that idea. Okay, if they can't produce evidence in 3 months, got to ask yourself, is it a problem with the team? They've never done it before. Their process still, they didn't put enough time. Or is it really the idea? And in general, it's usually the idea, if you gave the team enough time and energy to do it. So you really kill those ideas based on evidence. You invest based on evidence, evidence-based investment. Now, that sounds extremely obvious and extremely simple, but it's not what we do in most companies. Even investors sometimes, they don't invest like this. Now, it's a bit easier with investors because they have a large portfolio, so eventually they'll get it because they make a lot of wrong bets to make a right one. We still need to keep this same approach because you're going to kill 10 ideas and one is going to, thrive out of those 10. So that's the mindset we need. And at every stage, we need to ask for different type of evidence. At the very beginning, light evidence, like from customer interviews, will be fine. The further on you go, the stronger the evidence needs to be, right? So after 6 months, depending on the industry, you want pre-purchases. And if you're an industry where, pre-purchases don't exist, we're talking about investment goods, well, then you need something else, a memorandum, an understanding with the customer that we're actually going to do this, co-creation with the customer. I work a lot with pharmaceutical companies. Sometimes you have one client, which is the government. In every country, you have one client that's the government. Guess what? You need early evidence from the government that they're willing to invest in this or that or that. So we need to gather evidence from the beginning. And again, what sounds obvious is rarely designed into the processes of companies and sometimes not even, of entrepreneurs.
Yeah. It's very much about focusing on those leading indicators like feedback, customer sign-ups, pre-purchases and things of that sort, rather than the revenue, which is essentially the trailing indicator of those those forms of validation. So, earlier you touched on reinventing your business model to adapt to changes in your environment, but also perhaps to be proactive about it before those changes take hold. As Scott Anthony likes to talk about, a burning platform, where if you wait for a burning platform, either you get burnt to a crisp or you jump into freezing cold water and die of hypothermia or something like that. Now, in your book, you profile a company called Hilti, which is a tool manufacturer that reinvented their business model, but didn't wait for the world to change before they did it. What can you tell us about them?
So what was really interesting, that Hilti suffered financially during the financial crisis, and they really pivoted strongly with their business model. They didn't come up with a new business model, if you want, from scratch. They shifted, we call these business model shifts, a business model that was focused around products, building and selling products, light machine tools for builders. They shifted towards a service, not just an add-on, but a service business model. And we call that, a pattern, a shift pattern from product to service. So they transformed the company to, offer a whole kind of rental service where they would take away one of the biggest pains of their customers, which was to manage the logistics around the tool. So they would help the construction companies they were working with their entire logistics. Right tool, right construction site, right time. That's the biggest pain. Their old business model, would build better tools. That wouldn't help with that pain. But their new business model would bring the right tools to the right construction site at the right time, which is a huge pain, because if the construction sites stop, very huge costs, right? So they pivoted the entire thing there. Now, what sounds like, we just, replace the product with a service, is actually a very, very substantial shift of the entire business model and all of its components. So Dr. Loos, the CEO of Hilti, talks about how difficult this shift actually was, going from an old business model to a new one, because they didn't know much of the underlying assumptions. How do you manage a service business model? You have thousands of people, a fleet of cars around the world. You don't know the cost structure even. How do we price this thing? They don't know, right? So they had to go through this valley of uncertainty to get towards certainty. Now, they didn't use the lean startup approach back then. They didn't know of that, but they used something similar on a longer time frame. So they constantly adapted this model until they got it right. And they piloted it in a few countries before they scaled it to the entire globe, right? So they actually applied lean startup, if you want, without knowing it, on a longer time frame, and not with the same tools and the same speed and the same rigor, but they actually did it. And that brings me back to, sometimes people say, yeah, but companies who've done this successfully, did they use your tools? And say, well, many of them didn't, because they didn't know of them. That doesn't mean the tools don't work. So if you ask those companies, once they use the tools, well, why are you using these tools if you've done it without them before? They will always tell you the same answer. We paid a huge price to get there. It was really hard. And the tools and processes that we know of now would have helped us get there a lot faster. So this argument, but they didn't use it, is a really silly one, right? So So this is really interesting. Many of the case studies some of the case studies we use in our new book, we use them as learning cases. Not all of them necessarily applied all of our tools. Some of them did, some of them didn't. But they're great learning cases because today there are not that many invincible companies. There are not that many companies that do all of this together. I mentioned Bosch. They're probably only at the beginning of their journey. I mentioned Ping An, world class. They went really fast, in less than a decade, they transformed. But even they still have big potential for improving these things and making them more systematic. But they were a pioneer that got a lot of things right because they used the underlying principles.
Yeah, it is a question I'm often asked as well. Can you name some companies who are doing this just perfectly? And I simply can't. I mean, there are companies that do some things really well, but then there's a whole bunch that they're not. It's still early days. I mean, the need for companies to apply this sort of explore and exploit approach now is a lot more pronounced now than what it was, say, 25 years ago when change was a lot slower than it is today. So companies are working this out as they go. But of course, with tools like yours, with the support that's being provided through people in this space, they can definitely at least cut down the cost and take out some of that risk. But with regards to Hilti, you did touch on something around patterns. And rather than trying to compete with companies on a product, price, or tech, which you say is a rat race essentially to the bottom, you say that they should build business models based on patterns. And you've identified 9 of these patterns in your book, which you call Invent. I'd love for you to just unpack a little bit about what patterns are and how companies might use them.
Okay, so let me quickly jump into a quick drawing again. So, some of you might know the business model canvas, the listeners, and if you don't, you just Google it. You'll find some stuff there, right? So we like to draw like this. These are invent patterns. You start from let's say a green field. You have nothing. You have an idea of a market opportunity of where you could go, or a new technology you're working on, some idea you have as an entrepreneur, as an innovator. Now, you might just build that product and think you'll get successful, but usually you don't really get towards defensible business models. So we created this thing that we call business model patterns, which are characteristics that some business models have in common. And they give you pieces, bricks of configurations of your business model that you can apply to your idea in order to build a stronger business model around your idea, which again, it could be a technology, it could be a product, could be a market opportunity, it could be a patent you have. And by applying that, you will create a better business model, your real case, that will be more defensible here, okay? So we start from a green field and we ask ourselves, how could we do this? Well, we could do it with this kind of business model pattern. We get to a case. Okay, that's very abstract. Now, let me give you an example. The iPod, how did it look like? I don't remember. Something like this, right?
Close enough.
Okay. Close enough, right? When Steve Jobs pulled this thing out of his pocket and said, this is the first time we could put 1,000 songs in a pocket, everybody saw technology innovation, which it was. It's a new device, new hardware, new software that would allow you to put 1,000 songs in your pocket. First time we could ever do that. Now we can put 1,000 DVDs, if we even remember what DVDs are, right? 1,000 movies, high quality, high def, into a pocket. Back then it was hard. So everybody saw a product innovation. What people don't know is he actually had a business model strategy. Why did Steve Jobs back then want us to put 1,000 songs into our pocket or into iTunes and into the iPod? Very simple. Once you have all your music on that device in that software, it's actually very hard to switch to get that music out again back then. So you would go back and buy, Apple players, iPods again. Next time you would buy, you would be locked in. So we call this business model pattern of locking in customers, we call that a gravity creator. So if you look at the business model, you'll see certain blocks that everybody who used this strategy has the same thing. They lock in customers with their value proposition. They create strong switching costs, which leads to bigger lifetime value of your customer. Because guess what? once you buy it, you bought an iPod back in the day, you would be very unlikely to switch because it's very hard to get out of that system. Mm-hmm. So recurring revenues, and that I would say was the foundation for the empire around the iPhone. Okay, so we call those gravity creators. That's one strategy you can use. One of those 9 business model patterns, invent patterns, for you to create a better business model. Now think of an example that didn't do this really well, and then I'll get back to the iPod. GoPro cameras. So very famous brand, right? You know, cameras that are used by surfers, by snowboarders. My son loves, snowboarding with his GoPro cam. But here's the thing. There were no switching costs in that business model. There was nothing that would protect the business model. So while they were hyped by the stock market, they grew, it was very predictable that if GoPro didn't change their business model, if they didn't somehow lock in the customers or do something else, patents would be a different strategy. We call those resource castles. They had nothing in their business model, no business model pattern that would make it defensible. And that's why today GoPro is not in the same position as before, because their business model was not very good. Great products, great brand, but their business model was terrible. They did, to their credit, they tried, but they couldn't make that shift. Now back to the iPod, right? So I talked about switching costs, but gravity creators locking in customers. What happened to the iPod? Spotify happened, right? So Spotify killed the switching cost, which means you can't live with the same business model over decades. You will be disrupted, inevitably. Sometimes it's 2 years, sometimes it's 20 years, but you don't know, right? So Apple was not ready for that, right? They were not ready for reinventing themselves. So they had to, they were pressured through an insurgent. So that's the mindset you constantly need, is how could I improve my business model? How could I either create new ones, or how could I shift my old business model to a new one? That's what we've seen with Hilti. How could I apply one of these patterns? Yeah. So I think there's a huge opportunity there, because in most markets, most arenas, companies don't think business models. Take banking, finance, take pharmaceuticals. They don't think business models yet. And I don't see that as a weakness. I see that as the biggest opportunity on the planet. And guess what? Ping An was one of the first movers to really take advantage of that. So they shifted business models, okay? That's why they're now in the top 30 companies of the world. And it's not UBS, Credit Suisse, or Barclays, because they don't have that attitude. So think business models, think reinvention, and inevitably, if you have the right leadership, you will get to the top, because there's still opportunity. In 10 years, it will be difficult because everybody's going to do it.
Yeah, and if you have the right leadership and culture, not only do you have the opportunity to do so, but unlike startups who may be somewhat cash-strapped, you could have a much bigger bank account to deploy, more domain expertise to deploy to a problem, and potentially give yourself a better chance of success, providing you do what we talked about earlier and give people the opportunity to actually do these things, to fail, to try.
But here's where I would push back. I actually believe that, at least until COVID-19, startups were better funded and better incentivized than corporate ventures. So there's this myth that corporate ventures are better funded. They are not. R&D, research and development, is well funded, but not the exploration of new value propositions and business models. And that's a huge problem. And that's why today, many companies will get disrupted by insurgents, because the insurgents were, at least until recently, much better funded, and they have only one incentive: to create a value proposition that creates value for customers and a business model that can scale. That was what they were incentivized to do. Today in companies, we don't have that clear incentive structure to create new growth engines. Yeah. In the future, I agree with you. If companies get it right, they will be very, very serious competitors to startups. Today, I think startups are more serious. Steve Blank likes to call this shift from ankle biters. They were just little ankle biters annoying big companies. Now they're becoming these killer bees, right? That we were seeing emerging in the US. Startups are now a serious threat because they're better funded, faster, and better incentivized to create scalable growth engines. But I do think, Scott Anthony talks a little bit about this. If corporations get it right, and that's why we wrote this new book, The Invincible Company, we believe corporations can get it right. Medium-sized companies and big ones, this is not just for the big ones, also for the small ones, they have to get this right to survive the insurgent startups.
Yeah. Well, it kind of reminds me of the war between the Soviet Union and the Finns just before World War II, when the Soviets crossed the border into Finland, and the Finns kept a relatively small sort of peacetime army, about 1/20th the size of the army that the Soviets sent in, but they essentially won the battle on the ground, something like 5-1 in terms of casualties, and that's just because of the way they worked. It wasn't because they had more numbers, it's because of they wore these white tunics so they could take on the appearance of ghosts as they walked through the snowfields and picked off the Soviet adversaries one by one. It's really not about just resources, but how you deploy those resources and how you adapt to your environment.
And they were defending their country. So the incentives were different. So think of it. Take the startups. Startups are a lot more attached to their company, the employees of the startups, than today the employees of established companies. So another thing that COVID-19 is going to change substantially, people say, everybody's working from home. I don't trust people, that they're doing their work. Guess why you can't trust them? Because you treated them like shit for a long time, so they're not going to identify with your corporation, right? Mm-hmm. So, 7 out of 10 people, they don't want to work for the company they're working for. They don't want to do the job they want to do, right? That's a terrible statistic. 7 out of 10 people are wasting their time during work.
Yep.
That can't be. So we need to create better organizations where people are excited, come to work, excited every morning, give their best for the time that they're at work, and they're treated well so they can do the best work ever, right? That is not the case in many, many organizations. Some are starting to stand out. Netflix is a great example with the culture code that they put out there, HubSpot. And so it is changing. It started to change before COVID-19. Again, I think COVID-19 will be a catalyst to completely change corporate culture. It just has to happen because we went through so much during this crisis. We're going to see some good stuff coming out of this.
Yeah, I hope so as well. And I definitely think that from an intrinsic motivation perspective, what Dan Pink talked about around the science of motivation, giving people the opportunity to learn, to grow, to master something, the autonomy, and of course, the purpose, like really believing in what that company is achieving, is more likely to get the behaviors that you want out of people to the point where you don't need to worry about what they're doing while they're working from home, because they're focused on working towards achieving that mission. So perhaps we'll finish with this, Alex, just on Airbnb, because we have been talking about, say, the new school, the bees instead of the ankle biters. And Airbnb is one of these companies that's come along, say, in the last 12 years or so, that's really just disrupted the way people go about lodging and traveling and vacationing. But I know you profiled them in your book, but they've also been having somewhat of a difficult time in the last, say, 12 months. I know in 2018, they recorded a profit, but last year, for the first 9 months, there was like a $200 million loss. And just yesterday, they laid off 25% of their staff. But based on what you know about Airbnb, having profiled them in the book, what do you think what characteristics that underpin their business model do you think will help them to get through this and come out of it stronger?
So if you take Airbnb, and the layoff yesterday, actually two things. Part of it is in the organizational culture they created in business models and exploratory capability. But the other part is the company culture in general, what's really underlying the way they work. So and I really recommend that people read the letter that Brian Chesky wrote to his team, actually to the company and to the people who were let go. That's mandatory reading for any leader, small or big company, because COVID-19 is an atomic bomb scenario. A lot of companies had to let go people. This is so extreme that, many cases, if you're in the travel industry or in tourism, there's no chance you can just go on. You'd need a war chest of hundreds of billions of dollars, right? And nobody has that much of a buffer to survive 2 years of economic crisis in front of us. But how Airbnb parted paths shows the culture that they created, people at the center. And that the way they let go of people, they didn't even use that word. They explain exactly every part of the decision making. They explain why they had to do it. And of course, some people are going to be angry and disgruntled, but the reality is Airbnb cannot survive if they don't cut the cost structure. So they had to do it. And again, this is an exploratory capability of, okay, these are the hard calls we have to make. If we don't make them, we're going to die. But there are different ways of making that call. And the way they treated people with respect, with decency, that is the difference, right? You take Disney, is a bit of a tricky case, right? They let go of 100,000 people, but how they did it and, how they got to the decision while they're paying out dividends, while they're paying bonuses, completely different ballgame, right? Same decision, we have to cut back because we're under pressure. We can't survive by keeping everybody. And that, sometimes for the survival of the company, of the core, you have to make those hard calls. But how you implement them, huge difference. And that's why, I really, would say Airbnb, the culture they created, has less to do with the business model, but the operations, that shows that even the, 90% of the people who have to leave Airbnb and now will understand that decision and will respect it because they were also treated with respect. So that's the first one. But then the other one, I'd say, and again, easy to say when you're not in these decisions, it did take them probably a long time making that decision when probably to them it was also pretty obvious that they would have to do it, but they hesitated because they didn't, they love their team, but they made it. And, how they're going to come out of this is definitely going to be stronger because again, you can't just focus on exploration. They had to protect the core, the exploit, the execution. They had to narrow it, slim it down to something that's manageable. They didn't completely kill exploration. They also reduced exploration, but everything to a level where they can grow from it again. And because they put in place that whole organizational structure to do that, because they put in place the culture to do that, I believe they will definitely come out of this stronger. This is one of the industries that is most affected beside airlines. That you can even survive in this scenario is a miracle, right? So that they were able to raise money and that they believe they can survive is, a very strong sign of the health of their business. Because this is for the tourism industry, this is an atomic bomb scenario. For 2 years, you almost have to assume you're going to have to practically no revenues. That's crazy. That anybody can survive that. Wow, chapeau. So I believe, and they didn't ask for government handouts like Uber did or the airlines did, right? That's not their first reaction. Their first reaction is, how can we do this? How can we protect our business? How can we protect our team? And then they made very strong, smart decisions and executed them with brilliance. I'm really, really impressed of how Airbnb is handling this very, very, very difficult scenario. I would not want to be in their situation now. Very tough crisis to manage. They're at the center of the storm.
They are indeed. And as any startup who has been riding the wave finds out, when they have a few tough days, the media jumps all over it and just amplifies the negativity, despite their best intentions to weather the storm in the most humane way possible. But that's the media. They want to get those clicks. So that is what it is. But Alex, I really enjoyed this conversation. I'm sure our audience will get a lot out of it. And I highly recommend that they maybe not head out, but maybe head online to Amazon to pick up a copy of the book while we're still in lockdown. But people can also connect with you online on Twitter at Alex Osterwalder. They can find out more about your work with Strategyzer at strategyzer.com. And you've also kindly offered Future Squared listeners 10% off your online course on testing business ideas and mastering business models, which people can find out about at collectivecampus.io/online. And that's basically it. Did you have anything you wanted to share with our audience before we let you go, Alex?
Yeah, I want to thank you for doing this great work, having a great podcast, and sharing the knowledge and experience of a lot of people around the world. So thank you.
Thank you. Stay safe. Thank you very much.
Take care. Bye bye.